Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanasha Karanam Bhaveshwaram Swikritang Garbhavasa Deha Pashamidrisham Yapitam Swalela cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam Swalela cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram. Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, God of gods and Lord of existence, who of his own free will took on human birth and lived a luminous life of divine play for the destruction of human ills. We salute that incarnation, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, who was worshipped by pure-hearted disciples like Swami Vivekananda, and who was ceaselessly served by Sri Sarada Devi, the Divine Mother herself. Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Karma Shapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Jana. O Lord, your nectar-like words are praised by the wise and full of auspiciousness. They destroy the curse of evil, bring good to those who hear them, and bring new life to those who are scorched by the ills of worldly existence. Magnanimous indeed are they who spread your message. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om. Om Peace. Peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning we'll continue our study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, and we are on October 10th, 1883, near the bottom of page 304. So on this day, Sri Ramakrishna had gone to Adhar's house in Calcutta. Adhar Sen was a close devotee of Sri Ramakrishna, and he, like many people who had the means then and now, was performing the Durga Puja in his home. Not that he was doing the ceremony himself; he was the host, but the Durga Puja was being celebrated in his house. And so Sri Ramakrishna had come, Balaram Babu's father had come, and the neighbors and friends of Adhar had assembled also. And so in what we read of this day last time, which was on Navami, the 9th day of the lunar fortnight, and the next to the last day of Durga Puja, in what we had read, Sri Ramakrishna had arrived and had sung a number of songs in a state of ecstasy. First to the Divine Mother, and then because Balaram's father was a Vaishnava, and there were other Vaishnavas there, he sang some Vaishnava songs as well, and some songs about Sri Chaitanya, because there was a friend of Adhar's, Sarada Babu, who was a devotee of Sri Chaitanya. And so now, after he had sung a number of songs in ecstasy, M continues the narration. Balaram's father was a wealthy man with estates in different parts of Orissa. An orthodox member of the Vaishnava sect, he had built temples and arranged for distribution of food to the pilgrims at various places. He had been spending the last years of his life in Vrindavan. So let me stop here in the middle of the paragraph before we get on to his attitude. To say Sri Ramakrishna here is, M here is telling about Balaram's father and how he was living. So the way he was living was a very virtuous way. In what's to come in the rest of this paragraph, there's criticism of Balaram's father for his narrowness. And then later, in what we'll read today also, Sri Ramakrishna says that why do people like Balaram's father not progress in spiritual life? So all of that we should understand on the basis of the fact that Balaram's father was very devout, he was a good man, and he was leading a very good life. So the criticism that comes later is on top of that, that in spite of doing all of these things, leading such a good life and being charitable and so forth, why was he not making spiritual progress? So that's another question. When without context, we read something like this and read about Balaram's father, then we tend to think that he was a second-rate person. He was a person who was not worth much. He had all kinds of narrow ideas. He didn't progress at all in spiritual life. But no, this is Sri Ramakrishna's criticism is from a higher standpoint, and the same criticism that could be leveled against us. So we shouldn't take it to mean that Balaram's father was a useless person. No, he was a very good person. He was devout. He was very charitable. Even though Balaram himself was known to be very miserly, but his father was very wealthy and spent money in giving food to pilgrims and to devotees. He established temples, all of these things which in the Vaishnava tradition, in all Hindu traditions, it's considered meritorious, but especially in the Vaishnava tradition, where Vaishnav Seva, service to the other Vaishnavas, service to the devotees, is considered one of the highest practices you can do. And so Balaram's father was always doing japa. He was always telling his beads. He was charitable. He studied the devotional literature and so forth. And so again, it's on top of that that we have to understand Sri Ramakrishna's criticism. So then M continues. Again, picking up the last sentence I read, he had been spending the last years of his life in Vrindavan, the city which is most sacred to Krishna, because it's this even more than Dwaraka, because Vrindavan is where he lived his divine childhood, which devotees of Sri Krishna meditate on regularly. And so Balaram's father had been spending his last years there in Vrindavan. The Vaishnavas, for the most part, are bigoted in their religious views. Some of them harbor malicious feelings towards the followers of the Tantra and Vedanta. But Sri Ramakrishna never encouraged such a narrow outlook. According to his teachings, through earnestness and yearning, all lovers of God will ultimately reach the same goal. The master began the conversation in order to broaden the religious views of Balaram's father. So, as I explained in the class here recently, yes, the Vaishnavas are one of their characteristics, which is less than ideal, for which they're known, is a religious narrowness. Now, that, of course, is not exclusive to the Vaishnavas. There are many religious people all over the world in many religions and sects and denominations who are narrow, but the Vaishnavas are among those in India, where the tradition since ancient Vedic times was one of liberality. The Vaishnavas were known for being illiberal, that is, for thinking that Krishna was the only way to come to the highest realization, that Krishna was the divine himself, and other gods really existed to praise Krishna. And and again, that was not exclusive to the Vaishnavas in Hinduism either. There are some of the Shaiva sects. Usually, most of the Shaiva sects are liberal, but there are some Veera Shaivas and some others who are like the Vaishnavas. They are narrow. And of course, that is part of human nature. We think that until we learn better and until our heart opens, we think that everybody should think the way we think, everyone should do the way we do, everyone should believe in the way that we believe. So the master, Sri Ramakrishna, knew that Balaram's father had this flaw of many Vaishnavas, and so to broaden his outlook, he speaks to him. First, he speaks to M, actually, master to M, but of course in the hearing of Balaram's father. Once I thought, why should I be one-sided? Therefore, I was initiated into Vaishnavism in Vrindavan and took the garb of a Vaishnava monk. I spent 3 days practicing the Vaishnava discipline. Again, at Dakshineshwar, I was initiated into the mystery of Rama worship. I painted my forehead with a long mark and put on a string with a diamond round my neck. But after a few days, I gave them up. So Sri Ramakrishna tells of the time that he went to Vrindavan. He spent a long time in Vrindavan. But for 3 days, he wore the dress, as he says here, he wore the dress of a Vaishnava monk. But after 3 days, he went back to his regular dress. So why was that? Well, Sri Ramakrishna, whenever he practiced anything, he went into it as completely as possible. He identified with the tradition and with the practices, so that when he practiced the Sufi path of Islam, the mystical path of Islam, he even wanted to eat Muslim-style food and dress as a Muslim, etc. He wanted to identify with the path itself in all of its particularities. But in general, as he will say in what we're about to read further on, he was not in favor of external show in religion. And so when he went to Vrindavan, entering into this mood of a Vaishnava, after he had been worshiping Mother Kali for many years, because he was born into a Vaishnava family, but now after worshiping Mother Kali for many years, he came to Vrindavan, and so he identified with the Vaishnavas during that time and wanted to put on their dress. The dress of a Vaishnava monk, it's not like or it's not put on with the same idea as the monk of a sannyasi of the Dashanami Sampradaya. The Vaishnavas, if they want to live as a dedicated practitioner, then they can just put on the ochre cloth. It doesn't have to come with a ceremony and with the traditions of sannyasa. In fact, many Vaishnava Babajis wear the Gerwa cloth even though they're married and so forth. So Sri Ramakrishna put that cloth on for 3 days, but then he took it. Then he went back to his old dress. One might think, well, for 3 days, what can you gain in 3 days? But we have to remember that Sri Ramakrishna, within 3 days, he often plumbed the depths of a spiritual tradition. It was for 3 days that he was absorbed in the idea of Christ, of Jesus. And he had his realizations within 3 days about Christianity and Jesus. It was for 3 days that he practiced the path of the Sufi path of Islam. And within that time, he attained to the highest consciousness. And so 3 days for Sri Ramakrishna was not like 3 days for us. For Sri Ramakrishna, 3 days was a lifetime. So I spent 3 days practicing the Vaishnava discipline. Again, at Dakshineshwar, I was initiated into the mystery of Rama worship. And so when I say that his family was a Vaishnava family, his family was a Vaishnava family in the sense that they were worshippers of Rama. Though, as I said last time, his family was a very liberal, religiously liberal family. They had the image of the Divine Mother, they had the image of Shiva, they had the image of Rama, etc. So, but when he, in Dakshineshwar, when he was initiated into the Rama, the path of Rama worship, that lasted for quite some time. That was when there was a Jatadhari, the Vaishnava monk and devotee of Rama, who had come to Dakshineshwar, and Sri Ramakrishna spent a long time with him. So Sri Ramakrishna continues, a certain man had a tub. People would come to him to have their clothes dyed. The tub contained a solution of dye. Whatever color a man wanted for his cloth, he would get by dipping the cloth in the tub. One man was amazed to see this and said to the dyer, please give me the dye you have in the tub. So people would come to the clothes dyer and give him a white cloth. He'd dip it in and bring out whatever color the person wanted. And so most people were satisfied just getting the color that they liked. But the one man, being more intelligent than the other, he wanted the dye itself, because that had the power to produce any color. So M says in his commentary on that, was the master hinting that people professing different religions would come to him and have their spiritual consciousness awakened according to their own ideals? So Sri Ramakrishna was that dye maker, who people would come with the cloth of their mind, and Sri Ramakrishna would dip it in the dye of his spirituality, and it would come out the color of their chosen ideal, their chosen path. Though, as I said in a talk not too long ago, Sri Ramakrishna was both the dye, and he was both the dye maker, but he was also the dye itself. So Sri Ramakrishna was both the one who dipped people's minds into the dye of his spirituality, but he was the dye itself. People would come to him and their minds would be awakened according to their own ideal. Master to Balarama's father, don't read books anymore, but you may read books on devotion, such as the life of Sri Chaitanya. So Sri Ramakrishna often would say that to people when he wanted them to advance in spiritual life. Now, that doesn't mean that reading books is bad. There's a long period in our spiritual life when reading books is good. Spiritual books is good. We have to know what the path is. We have to know what to practice, how to practice. But there comes a time when just going on reading is no longer helpful. What we need to do is to immerse the mind in the ideal. So we shouldn't give up reading prematurely. If we give up reading prematurely, then we'll just spend all of our time watching television and other things. So as long as the mind wants entertainment, better to entertain it with spiritual books. But again, a time comes when we've read enough, and now the mind, if we push it, if we allow it, the mind can immerse itself in the spiritual path, and that is better than just going on reading about spirituality, which is sort of vicarious spirituality, trying to feel it through other people rather than trying to immerse our own minds in it. So Sri Ramakrishna tells him to don't read more books, just read things like the life of Sri Chaitanya. And in the Bengali gospel, he says Chaitanya Charitamrit. There are two main biographies of Sri Chaitanya, both of them very good. One, the Chaitanya Bhagavat, and the Chaitanya Charitamrit. And so Sri Ramakrishna says you may read books like Chaitanya Charitamrit. So again, it's also how we read. As we go deeper in spiritual life, when we read a book, the reading itself becomes a meditation, and that's not harmful. That's rather good. It's very good. In fact, Swami Vivekananda said about Latu Maharaj, Adbhutanandaji, that he was the miracle of Sri Ramakrishna because, he said, we, the other disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, we could read books and get inspiration and keep the mind on a higher plane by reading books, but Latu Maharaj couldn't even read or write. And so he had no way to read, and yet he was able to keep his mind immersed in God and to attain to realization. So again, the reading has its place, but it is a place that it has. It's not spirituality. Sri Ramakrishna continued, the whole thing is to love God and taste his sweetness. He is sweetness and the devotee is its enjoyer. The devotee drinks the sweet bliss of God. Further, God is the lotus and the devotee the bee. The devotee sips the honey of the lotus. As a devotee cannot live without God, so also God cannot live without his devotee. Then the devotee becomes the sweetness and God its enjoyer. The devotee becomes the lotus and God the bee. It is the Godhead that has become these two in order to enjoy its own bliss. That is the significance of the episode of Radha and Krishna. So that is the idea that the divine reality, the divine being, split itself into Krishna and Radha in order to enjoy the heights of divine love. And as he says here, that's true of the devotee. What is presented in ideal form in the life of the play between Sri Krishna and Sri Radha, that is true of all of us if we learn to love God. That sometimes we find that God is the sweetness, God is the lotus, and we, the bee of our mind, wants to sip the honey of the lotus of God, the sweetness of God. But sometimes God wants to sip the nectar of our hearts, that is, taste the sweetness of the devotee. And so God comes to us. So in the devotional path, this is a well-developed theme, the idea of the devotee sipping the bliss of God, but God also sipping the nectar of the devotee's heart, this interplay of love. It's not just that we should develop love for God, but God loves us. God, of course, doesn't have to develop love for us. God has love for us, but for the devotee especially, why? Is God partial? No, it's because the devotee's heart is open to God and open to God's activity. So it's not that God says, well, I don't like those people that don't have devotion. I only like people that are devoted. No, that's a very narrow idea and imparts partiality to God, which is not true. It's that the heart of the devotee is open to God, and their God's activity can be seen and felt and experienced. At the beginning, Sri Ramakrishna continues, at the beginning of spiritual life, the devotee should observe such rites as pilgrimage, putting a string of beads around the neck, and so forth. But outward ceremonies gradually drop off as he attains the goal, the vision of God. Then his only activity is the repetition of God's name and contemplation and meditation on him. And so, yes, that Sri Ramakrishna always emphasized, that the external signs of religion are for show, and that he'll develop more in what we're about to read. The idea that the external signs of religion are for advertising our religion to others. And so in the beginning, by wearing the insignia of religion, the beads and the mark on the forehead, as they would do in India, or in Christian countries wearing a big cross and other signs of religiosity, then the religion goes inside. In the beginning, one may put on the insignia in order to remind oneself. But later one finds that that itself is a distraction. One wants to keep one's religiosity, one's spirituality deep inside. So that it becomes something that is internally enjoyed and has nothing to do with external show. Both in the East and the West, people are suspicious of the overly pious, those who make a great show of religion are often not to be trusted. And that's why Sri Ramakrishna has stories like the story about the thieves who would dress up in the Vaishnava garb and chant the name of God. But while they were chanting the name of God, it was a signal to each other of the shopkeepers when and how to steal from the people who had come into their shop. So Sri Ramakrishna was never fond of the external show of religion. And that you find in the Christian Bible also in the teachings of Jesus. He says the same thing, that the scribes and Pharisees, they wear their religion outside for everyone to see. But when you pray, then go into the closet, close the door, and pray to God who is in secret. And so that's the idea here. The pennies equivalent to 16 rupees make a great heap, but 16 silver coins do not look like such a big amount. Again, the quantity becomes much smaller when you change the 16 rupees into one gold mohur. And if you change the gold into a tiny piece of diamond, people hardly notice it. So again, if you change, we'll say dollars, or you change $16 into pennies, it's a big pile of coins. But if you just have $16 or even a 10, a 5, and a 1, then you just have 3 pieces of paper. And if you change it into a gold coin, then it's even less. And then if you convert it into a diamond, then it's very small and it's easily concealed. And so the greater the value, the less showy the thing is. The lesser the value, then the larger the quantity, the visible quantity of it is. And so the idea is that when we don't have much spirituality, we want to show it by all kinds of signs and emblems to let everybody know that we are spiritual. But as we become more spiritual, it goes inside. So again, same as what he had said in the previous paragraph. In the last line of the previous paragraph was, then his only activity is the repetition of God's name and contemplation and meditation on him. And that's what becomes important. And that is all internal, not external for show. Just after I had taken sannyasa, I went, as many of us do when we become swamis, sannyasis. I went on pilgrimage across different places of North India. I spent about a month on pilgrimage. And first I went to Benares, and then I went to Vrindavan. And in Vrindavan, there's Swami Saradeshanandaji was still alive. Gopesh Maharaj, a very saintly, highly spiritual disciple of Holy Mother, who had been very close to Holy Mother. There's a beautiful book of his about his acquaintance with his life with Holy Mother. So I went to see him. I had known him before, and I wanted to pay my respects to him. And so in talking to him, he asked about what I was going to do now that I was a sannyasi. I said, no, I want to live in India for some more years. And now after sannyasa, I've gotten the Garawa cloth. If I go to America, then I'll have to wear regular shirt and pants, and will not have the advantage of being reminded by the cloth that I'm wearing of of the sannyasa that I've just been granted. And so Gopesh Maharaj didn't like that at all. He raised himself up and spoke with great force with a scolding voice. He says, that doesn't matter at all. That's not at all important. You have to make your heart Garawa. Who cares what you wear? It's the heart that has to be turned into Garawa. He was not at all pleased with my sentiment, my devout sentiment, that I wanted to wear the Garawa cloth. So that's the idea. That as one progresses, then one's spirituality becomes more internal. So, Orthodox, the M and now speaking, commenting, Orthodox Vaishnavas insist on the outer insignia of religion. They criticize any devotee who does not wear these marks. Was that why the Master said that after the vision of God, a devotee becomes indifferent to outer marks, giving up formal worship when the goal of spiritual life is attained? So yes, that the Vaishnavas are famous for wearing the marks and putting tulsi beads everywhere, and wearing cloth that says Hari Ram, Hari Krishna all over it, and so forth. Very devoted to the external signs of religion. Uh, Master to Balaram's father. The Karta Bhajas group the devotees into four classes: the Pravartaka, the Sadhaka, the Siddha, and the Siddha of the Siddha. The Pravartaka, the beginner, puts the mark of his religion on his forehead, wears a string of beads around his neck, and observes outer conventions. The Sadhaka, the struggling devotee, does not care so much for elaborate rites. An example of this class is the Baul, the minstrels of Bengal. The Siddha, the perfect, firmly believes that God exists. But the Siddha of the Siddha, the supremely perfect, like Sri Chaitanya, not only has realized God, but has also become intimate with him and talks with him all the time. This is the last limit of realization. So again, the beginning devotee, the Pravartaka, wears all of the insignia and everything because they don't have anything else we have to show. And so they're always carrying the bag of beads around with them. And while they're talking to you, they're telling their beads, and carrying on business, they're telling their beads and so forth. But everything is shown externally. But then the sadhaka, the one who is sincerely struggling, they're firmly on the path and are sincerely struggling for the attainment of God, then they don't pay so much attention to those external things. And then the siddha, the one who has become aware of the presence of God and is immersed in the thought of God, then they don't pay any attention to it at all. And then there's the siddha of the siddha, the one who is has attained to God, like Sri Chaitanya. Then they are in a class by themselves. There are many kinds of spiritual aspirants. Those endowed with sattva perform their spiritual practices secretly. They look like ordinary people, but they meditate inside the mosquito curtain. Aspirants endowed with rajas exhibit outward pomp, a string of beads around the neck, a mark on the forehead, an ochre robe, a silk cloth, a rosary with a gold bead, and so on. They are like stall keepers advertising their wares with signboards. That's a very good analogy. Uh, all religions and all paths call upon their followers to pray to one and the same God. Therefore, one should not show disrespect to any religion or religious opinion. It is God alone who is called Satchidananda Brahman in the Vedas, Satchidananda Krishna in the Puranas, and Satchidananda Shiva in the Tantras. It is one and the same Satchidananda. So again, here he comes back to that the basis of religious liberality, that one should not be narrow in religion, that one should recognize that all are worshiping the same God. And when one does that, then one can delight in all paths. We keep to our own path, we keep to our own ishta, but we're not afraid of people following other paths. We delight in their path. And if we are with them when they are worshiping their aspect of God or their understanding of God, then we can delight in that as well. So here, again, Sri Ramakrishna is correcting two main tendencies in Balaram's father, which come along with his being a Vaishnava. Again, Sri Ramakrishna had nothing against Vaishnavas. Most of his many of it, don't know about most because I haven't counted them in that sense, but many of his devotees and many of his close devotees were Vaishnavas. And so he had nothing against Vaishnavas at all. But it was these two tendencies among Vaishnavas which he always sought to counteract. One being the tendency towards narrowness, and the other being the tendency towards wearing religion as a signboard, announcing it to everybody, making a show of religion. The interesting thing, I spent some time in Holland some years ago, about 12, 13 years ago. In Holland, uh, uh, religion is something that you don't talk about, something that you never show any signs of being religious. But the interesting thing is that many people in Holland, many people in Holland, a large portion of the population, they are on a spiritual path, whether it's Christian, Catholic, or Protestant, or some other spiritual path, Hindu or Buddhist or something else, or Sufi or whatever. It's just something that they don't talk about, or they have a dislike for advertising religion. Sri Ramakrishna continues, there are different sects of Vaishnavas. That which is called Brahman in the Vedas is called Alek Niranjan by one Vaishnava sect. Alek means that which cannot be pointed out or perceived by the sense organs. According to this sect, Radha and Krishna are only two bubbles of the Alek. So here the Vaishnavas of this sect, they believe in the reality which is beyond all manifestation, beyond a name and form, but that takes on form of Radha and Krishna. But Radha and Krishna are just forms of that indivisible Alek, Niranjan. Niranjan meaning pure, and Alek, that which is which can't be pointed out, that which can't be indicated, that which is beyond mind and concept. And so Sri Ramakrishna, of course, is speaking approvingly of this idea. And then he says, according to the Vedanta, and here when Sri Ramakrishna speaks of Vedanta, he means Advaita, because that was, and still is, the general understanding of the term Vedanta in India. Now, there are many types of Vedanta, including dualistic Vedanta, qualified monistic Vedanta, the Krishna consciousness followers. They are Vedantins also, but they follow a dualistic Vedanta. But generally in India, when someone just says, oh, he's studying the Vedanta nowadays, they mean Advaita Vedanta, and that's what Sri Ramakrishna also meant. Almost always when you see him speaking of Vedanta, he's speaking of Advaita Vedanta. So according to the Vedanta, that is Advaita Vedanta, there is no incarnation of God. The Vedantas say that Rama and Krishna are but two waves in the ocean of Satchidananda. So you remember on Sri Ramakrishna's deathbed, just a day or two before he passed away, Swamiji, or still Naren at that time, Narendranath was standing by his bed, or maybe sitting by his bed, probably sitting because the bed was on the floor, looking at Sri Ramakrishna. And he thought to himself, he didn't say anything, but thought to himself, if in this state of extreme debility and sickness, he can still say that he is an incarnation of God, then I might believe him. So Swamiji at that time was still doubting Sri Ramakrishna. And so Sri Ramakrishna, who could read the minds of all, looked up at Narendranath and said, oh, Naren, are you still full of doubt? He who was born as Rama, he who was born as Krishna, is born again this time as Ramakrishna, but not in your Vedantic sense. Again, meaning Advaita Vedanta, non-dualistic Vedanta. Meaning that in the Advaitic sense, everything is an incarnation of God. Each of us is an incarnation of God. This book is an incarnation of God. Everything is an incarnation of God. That is, everything is Brahman manifested in name and form. And if we look at anything into the depths of it there, we see the shining Brahman. And so everything is an incarnation of God. And the ones normally referred to technically as incarnations of God, they are just waves on the ocean of Satchidananda, which everything is. And again, Sri Ramakrishna said, no, he who is born as Rama and he who is born as Krishna has been born again, this time as Ramakrishna, but not in your Vedantic sense. So that's what Sri Ramakrishna is referring to here also. According to the Vedanta, again, there is no incarnation of God. The Vedantas say that Rama and Krishna are but two in the ocean of Satchidananda. And it's not, excuse me, and it's not that that view is wrong. In fact, Swamiji later says, I think it's in Inspired Talks, that I am the ocean on which the waves of incarnations arise, meaning not I, Swami Vivekananda alone, but I who am Satchidananda, speaking for everyone, because everyone is that Satchidananda. I am the ocean on which the waves of incarnations rise. So that's a true standpoint, but it's not the devotee's standpoint, and that's what Sri Ramakrishna was speaking from here as he most often spoke. So he continues, in reality, there are not two. There is only one. A man may call on God by any name. If he is sincere in his prayer, he will certainly reach him. He will succeed if he has longing. longing. And so Sri Ramakrishna always comes back to this, the necessity for longing for God, that you can call on God by any name and call on God by through any path, because there's only one. So by whatever name you use, whatever path you follow, you're seeking the same reality. And the requisite for attaining God is longing. As Sri Ramakrishna spoke these words to the devotees, he was overwhelmed with divine fervor. Coming down to partial consciousness of the world, he said to Balaram's father, "Are you the father of Balaram?" How strange. He knew Balaram's father very well, and he'd just been talking for the benefit of Balaram's father, and he knew all about Balaram's father, knew that he was wealthy, knew that he served the devotees, that he fed the poor, that he established temples. So he knew Balaram so well. But you see, Sri Ramakrishna's mind was returning from an ecstatic state where distinctions were not yet clear to him. After Sri Ramakrishna had been in Nirvikalpa Samadhi during the period of his spiritual practice for 6 months, he said that if someone served him a plate with different dishes, as they do in India with a thali, a big plate with the batis, little metal bowls of different types of dishes that you mix with your rice. He said if someone served him a plate like that, he had to mix everything together. He couldn't because everything was, he was so immersed in the state of oneness or the state of non-duality. He couldn't perceive distinctions. Everything came back to one for him. So even when he was eating, he had to mix everything together and then take it in that way. And so here he doesn't even recognize Balaram's father. Are you the father of Balaram? All sat in silence. So they knew that there was no need to answer, oh yes, this is Balaram's father, he lives in such and such a place, and he's so and so. They realized that Sri Ramakrishna was in an ecstatic state where he couldn't yet perceive distinctions clearly. All sat in silence. Balaram's aged father was silently telling his beads. Master to him and the others, well, these people practice so much japa and go to so many sacred places, but why are they like this? Why do they make no progress? In their case, it seems as if the year consists of 18 months. So that's a very famous statement of Sri Ramakrishna which we can identify with from the standpoint of Balaram's father, not from Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint. That is, after so much practice and so much striving and things, it seems like the year has 18 months. That is, that time is just a dragging on. We're not attaining to anything. And so Sri Ramakrishna is asking, why are these people like this? Why do they not make progress? And then he continues, once I said to Harish, what is the use of going to Benares if one does not feel restless for God? And if one feels that longing, then this very place is Benares. And so again, Sri Ramakrishna himself went on pilgrimage. He told others sometimes to go on pilgrimage, that it was good. But this deeper teaching is necessary to understand, even if we want to go on pilgrimage somewhere. That is, the place of pilgrimage doesn't make us. It's not that which makes us holy. Yes, it gives us some inspiration. It gives us good memories, good associations, and so it's a help. But far more important is developing longing for God. If we don't have longing for God, we can go to many places of pilgrimage and we'll come back the same person. It's just like spiritual tourism. We've just spent money and we've run around. I remember once when I was in Kanchipuram in South India some years ago. This was about 20 years ago. No, about 15 years ago. And I'd gone to the famous temple of the Divine Mother in Kanchipuram, one among many of the famous temples. It's a city of temples, or a town of temples. It's not a big city. And there was a Swami who jumped out of a rickshaw, which he'd probably just taken from the train station, and was rushing towards the temple, and told me as he was passing by me that this is, I've now visited, what was it? No, I'm sorry, it wasn't the Divine Mother Temple. It was one of the Shiva temples and one of the Jyoti Lingam Shiva temples. One of them is in Kanchipuram, I believe. So anyway, it was. He said that I've visited 10 of the Jyoti Lingams in India. Now this is my 11th, and so he rushes in and makes pranam, gets some prasad, and then comes back out. So counting off the number of Jyotilingams that you have seen. what is the value of just rushing to a place, traveling by train a long ways, spending money on the ticket, and going through the hardship of travel, and then jumping on a rickshaw and racing to the temple, and then falling flat. So okay, now I've seen number 11. I just have one more to do. So after you finish 12, then what are you going to do? After you finish 12, then you have to visit all the Shakti Pitas or something else of India. It's just a counting game, or like collecting stamps or collecting coins or something like that. So, so Sri Ramakrishna says that if you have longing for God, then you have no need to visit Benares. If you have no longing, then visiting Benares, you'll come back the same. And if you have longing, then what is the need for visiting Benares? You already have Benares wherever you are because you have longing. So he continues, they make so many pilgrimages and repeat the name of God so much, but why do they not realize anything? It is because they have no longing for God. God reveals himself to the devotee if only he calls upon him with a longing heart. So a devotee many years ago once told me, when she had first begun to read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, she came to me and said that she was disturbed by the Gospel and said that Sri Ramakrishna is criticizing people, but those people are like me. So yes, that's the point. He was criticizing Balaram, not for us to say, oh yeah, I'm Balaram's father, not for us to feel that, yeah, Balaram's father was a real idiot. He wasn't worth anything, just sitting there doing japa and not getting anywhere. No, he's talking to us through Balaram's, what he's saying about Balaram's father, that is our state. And why don't we make progress as we hope? It's because we haven't developed longing. So what good does it do to know that? And now I know that I'm not making progress because I don't have any longing, but I still don't have any longing, so what's the use of that? But no, if that idea goes into the mind through repeated readings of the gospel and hearing that in different contexts and different places, that idea of the necessity of longing goes deeper. And one day, if we just at least go through the motions of spirituality, which was all that Balaram's father was doing, going through the motions. But if we do that, the hope is that one day by doing that, then these ideas go deeper and deeper, and then longing comes, and then we begin to develop real spiritual life. And so that's what we want. We want that the longing to grow. And so if we don't know that, if we don't know that that's the secret ingredient that we're missing, that that's what is necessary for us to develop, then we think that all I need is to go through the motions, and that will do everything. No. When we don't have anything else, yes, go through the motions. Do japa, even if it's mechanical, that will help you. Say your prayers, even if they're mechanical, that will help you. Read spiritual books, even if you don't feel much, that will help you. Listen to talks on spiritual topics, that will help you. Go through the motions when that's all that we have. But know that that's not what religion is. That's what we're doing in order to awaken religion. But religion is when we begin to feel a longing, and then spiritual life begins to develop. And so again, Sri Ramakrishna is speaking about Balaram's father, not just for idle criticism or to make us think that Balaram's father was a useless person. No, it was for instructing us. And Sri Ramakrishna continues, at the beginning of a yatra performance, much light-hearted restlessness is to be observed on the stage. At that time, one does not see Krishna, that is, Krishna on the stage, where the play is going to be about Krishna. Next, the sage Narada enters with his flute onto the stage and sings longingly, O Govinda, O my life, O my soul. Then Krishna can no longer remain away and appears on stage with the cowherd boys. So that's a beautiful tale. It's taken from the tradition of the jatras in many parts of India, but I'm more familiar with the jatras of Bengal. In villages, that was the way people received religious education, was through these religious plays that were put on from village to village. It's a wonderful tradition. Now it's disappearing with the availability of television and movies and all of that. People have so many means of entertainment, even in village India now. But this was a wonderful way of getting education. People learned the stories of the Puranas and the Itihasas, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, and so forth, the stories of Krishna, the stories of Rama, Ram Lila, by watching the plays enacted on a stage. And from the standpoint of acting, yes, they were overacted, but they were charming. I saw many of these jatras in my early years in India, when they were still more common than they are now. And it was wonderful to see, because the simple villagers, they would be spellbound, and with the singing, all of them were full of songs and so forth, and so they really were spellbinding and made a deep impression on the mind. So here he's using this, the story of the jatra about the life of Krishna, that everybody's talking in the audience and everybody's distracted with what's happening in your life. Have you seen so and so, and what's going on with your children and so forth. But then suddenly Narada comes onto the stage. An actor playing Narada comes onto the stage with his stringed instrument and begins to sing, "O Govinda, O Krishna, where are you? My soul, my life, where are you?" And then with that opening, then the child Krishna, Gopala, and the cowherd boys appear on the stage, and then everyone's attention is focused there. And so again, the longing which is expressed by Narada, it's that which brings Krishna Gopala onto the stage. So we'll stop here. And next time we'll begin with Tuesday, October 16th. And so let me give announcements and then we'll give the closing prayer. So for announcements, on Sunday, the lecture is on society and the environment, a Vedantic perspective. The title is rather boring, but I hope the talk won't be. The talk was inspired by the fact that I had to write a chapter for a book being published in Germany, nothing to do with the Ramakrishna order, but a book on on environmentalism from a non-dualist perspective. And so because I was working on that, it was a big project, an important project. I'm the only Vedantin and only non-dualist writing for it. Others are people from different fields, more technical fields. So anyway, because that was in my mind, I wanted to speak about it. And the subject has value, even if the title is boring. So next week we will continue with the Katha Upanishad class on Tuesday evening and this gospel class on Thursday morning next week. And then the only other announcement for right now is that on Saturday, October 9th, we will have our Durga Puja, live streamed only because of the pandemic. And so we'll do it in a small way as we did last year. So the puja will begin at 10:30, and then at 12 there will be arati. And then by 12:15, those who would like to come to pay their respects to the image, to have darshan, to offer flowers, pushpanjali, and to receive prasad, blessed food, can come at that time, 12:15. And one family unit at a time will be allowed to come in. So those are the announcements for now. And let's see if there are any questions. Yes. Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, for meditation, does one have to make it formal? Oh, okay, there. Oh, that's strange. The phone did something funny. So first was, please spell the name of the books on the life of Chaitanya. Are they in English? There are English translations. I haven't read them, so I don't know how good they are. The translations I know are done by ISKCON. And they have their own way of interpreting things and their own language. But that is the tradition which comes down from Sri Chaitanya. And so Chaitanya Bhagavat. So Chaitanya, that the spelling you can get from the Gospel or anywhere, just Chaitanya. Bhagavat is Bhagavat, or sometimes there's an ending A also, Bhagavat or Bhagavata. Chaitanya Bhagavat. And then Chaitanya Charitamrit, again Chaitanya, his name, Charitamrita, Chaitanya Charitamrit or Charitamrita. But if you Google Chaitanya, Life of Chaitanya, you'll get them also. Also, what is the name of the book by Mother's disciple? I forget now, but I think it's Mother as I Saw Her, by Swami Gopesh Maharaj. Now suddenly I mentioned it in the talk, and now his sannyas name is escaping me. Next question. For meditation, does one have to make it formal, as in sit in front of the shrine and meditate? Or is thinking about God, even while driving, cooking, or any everyday activity, considered meditation? So, a good question. For meditation, well, let me tell a little story as a prelude to the answer. There were two disciples of a teacher, and they loved to smoke tobacco in their chillum. And so they were sitting smoking their chillum one day, and tobacco, and one of them said to the other, "It'd be so nice if we could smoke while we were meditating. I feel so relaxed when I'm smoking, and if we could smoke while meditating, that would really be wonderful. So why don't we ask the teacher?" So they went independently to the teacher. So one of them went to the teacher and said, "Sir, is it okay if I smoke while I'm meditating?" And the teacher said, "No, certainly not. When you meditate, you have to put your whole mind on God. That's ridiculous. Not to do anything else, just to sit and keep your mind fixed on God." The other disciple waited for some time and then went to the teacher and said, "Sir, while I'm smoking tobacco, is it okay if I meditate also?" And the teacher said, "Yes, you can meditate whenever you're doing anything." so, so it's all in how you ask the question. But no, the significance of the story is not that you should smoke a chillum of tobacco. The significance of it is that you can keep your mind on God when you're doing anything, driving, cooking, washing dishes, etc. Learn to think about God no matter what you're doing, and that is very good, very good. But there should be some time in the day when we sit and do nothing but meditate. When we just try to, if we don't have much time, or if we the mind stays distracted and we just can't concentrate, then you don't have to do it for a long time, because then you're just spinning your wheels and you get frustrated. But for some time, say at least for 10 minutes every day. That's minimal. More is better, but minimal is for 10 minutes every day. You should sit and do nothing else but do your japa or visualize or meditate in whatever way you meditate, but to do nothing else. So those are the questions for today. Very good questions. And so I'll give the closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anandarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama. We bow in adoration to Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, eternal, infinite, the worshipful Supreme Lord who took human birth out of compassion for all. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.